everybody, and welcome to Let's Talk Assassin's Creed, your number one podcast for all things Assassin's Creed. In today's episode, I'm going to be taking a look at 5 artifacts and how they can be transformed into pieces of Eden. It's very easy to look at an artifact in history and call it a piece of Eden and give it its abilities, but the hardest part of doing this episode was finding a way to connect it to the Assassin's Creed lore. And the reason why that was so difficult is pieces of Eden, you can't make a normal artifact overpowered and give it a story to jam into the lore. You have to make a believable scenario that it would fit. So before we start, I would like to thank Sir Flowers on the Sisterhood server who brought this to my attention through one artifact that I will cover soon, and for everyone who's given me other ideas and discussed about the podcast. Also, everything is theory crafted. I've done 22 hours research into every artifact, its history, and if there's any references in Assassin's Creed lore. And as I haven't read transmedia, there could be some mention through Easter eggs or actual events that I missed. So some of these may have been touched upon, but some may not have. Again, everything is theory crafted. There is no legitimacy to anything I'm going to discuss. It's all for theory, and maybe if Assassin's Creed wants to add them, then can you let me know that you got ideas from me? It would be nice to see a new piece of Eden hinted at by Let's Talk Assassin's Creed. I would kind of feel happy about that. So let's dive right in to the Crown of Thorns. Now, the Crown of Thorns is a legendary artifact that is more commonly known through religious texts, and as there has been several pieces of Eden known to be around Jesus' life, I wanted to take a look at the crown and how it could be represented as a piece of Eden. The ability that I think it could be represented would drain the physical energy from its wearer. I also believe that the Templars, who had control of Rome at the time, could have used this artifact believing Jesus was a sage. But there is no evidence that Jesus was ever a sage. He was a common man in the lore of Assassin's Creed. So I believe that this sage information was misinformation from local sources, because the piece of Eden that we know is in the lore around the time of Jesus' life, I believe that some, misinformation, some Chinese whispers could have led to false claims, and the Templars acted upon them false claims. Also, I believe that there is no evidence supporting the claims or any physical description of the artifact, and there isn't any real text on the artifact in the lore, in theory. So I think this makes a really great connection to lore. So in theory, this artifact will have no hard evidence to the Assassin's Creed lore, so it can be overlooked in the lore as something that doesn't exist in the lore. But let's say it did exist in the lore and it's been hidden. Now we know this artifact has resided under Notre Dame till the real-life catastrophic fire of 2019, where it was rescued and then moved to a secure location. In theory, I want to link this to the Assassin's Brotherhood of France. I believe that this piece of Eden, if it was a piece of Eden, could have been taken, hidden away, and all records deleted through time. So it's a piece of Eden that's gone under the radar, and it may not actually be a piece of Eden. This is the twist I want to add, that I actually do believe that this Crown of Thorns may not be a piece of Eden. And I know it goes against what I suggested, because these are meant to be pieces of Eden, but I want to take a unique look at the time zone and how time changes. So there is, in one theory, it was a piece of Eden that the Templars used for multiple purposes. It was then lost to time. The French Brotherhood captured it, kept it secret as they did with the Sword of Eden, as seen in the very start of Unity. And then during the real-life catastrophic fire, and let's say that happened in lore, then it would have been moved from Notre Dame by the Brotherhood to a more secure location. No one knows its whereabouts, its history, or its actual abilities. But there is also a hint that this may not be a piece of Eden. It's a very weird one to start with, and it was one that I've had a lot of chats with on how I could weave it into the lore and see how it would fit. So it's one that don't really necessarily do want to see in the game, but it was mentioned a couple of times when I looked for ideas, so I thought I'd do some research and see if it could fit. The next one I looked at was one that I kind of really liked, and one that I actually watched off a show called Mythbusters. Now, if anyone has ever watched Mythbusters, it is a fantastic show where they take myths and try and break them. It is fantastic. Some of the stuff they do is crazy. And the one that I really looked at was Robin Hood. And most notably, can you split an arrow in half by shooting an arrow in half? Now, through a lot of tests using Mythbusters, it wasn't impossible for an arrow to split another arrow. If I remember correctly, it depends on the strength, trajectory, and some other archery linguistics I don't know. But I thought it'd be really cool to put a spin on this as a bow of Eden, or a piece of Eden. Now, if we take a look at Valhalla, we have the Nodens Arc. The Nodens Arc is a really cool piece of Eden, well, bow of Eden, as I'm going to nickname it, that is really fast at shooting. I haven't used it much, so I just remember from some of the descriptions. And I wanted to theorycraft that during his crusade, his time during the crusade, Robin of Loxley found this bow. It has no distinguishable marks to detain it from a normal bow to a mythical bow because of how it was designed. So he just uses it. If it's already skills of archery, he doesn't realise the power this bow has. But over time, this bow is actually increasing his aim and strength of the shot. So when he enters his tournament and he's shooting the arrow and he splits the arrow in half, it looks like a mad feat by a very successful archer. But I think this would be a really cool artifact to then weave into the lore that this was just a piece of Eden helping. He didn't need just skill, he had a piece of Eden that could push the limits and help him. How this could tie into Assassin's Creed lore is there isn't much lore between Valhalla and the Crusade, just from what we see from Valhalla and the first Assassin's Creed. So we really don't know what happens with Robin Hood. So I wanted to say in theory that Hytham from Valhalla sets up the English Brotherhood, and Robin of Loxley is a assassin. I believe that he started his training in England, but then went with the king to the Crusades to continue his training in Messiah. We don't see him in Assassin's Creed because maybe he's just an NPC, so there's no real notably reason for him to be there or reason for us to see him. But he continues his training as an assassin, and as his skill grows as an assassin, he learns to be more skillful with a bow and a dagger than a hidden blade. Upon returning back to England, he realises that the Templars have took a foothold in his native town of Nottingham. So to do what he can, he uses his bow that he found to drive the Templars out. He becomes revered through legend for robbing the rich and helping the poor, because that was the greatest way that the assassins could help. They're always, the type of people to rob the rich and help the poor. It's kind of what they do if a rich is going around putting taxes and murdering people that don't pay taxes. It's the assassin that breaks that tyranny for freedom. So his actions already, I feel, are in line with assassins, and I believe that he would have worked with his band of merry men, which would have been his brotherhood, hidden in the forest, and as we know from Valhalla, it was very easy to hide some of these locations in plain sight. So he could have had a really good secret base to hide in, and him and his merry men went out to try and push the Templars back. Did it work? We don't know. Did he actually shoot an arrow in half? It's not impossible in real world, but at the same time it's very difficult, so we don't know. Robin of Loxley is known to be a myth himself. He's a great folk legend, Some say it was real, some say it wasn't. Which again is actually a great fit for Assassin's Creed, because giving a character with an ability or a weapon and saying that there's not much known about them gives Assassin's Creed developers more wiggle room. You can expand his story, give him more life, more depth, and more strength. This one is one of my favourites to look at, because I would love to see a tie-in game following Robin of Loxley as an assassin. As a main game, no. As a spin-off, yeah, I could see it. It'd be fun. Finding a bow of Eden, and then you could, even be a puzzle game where he's always using the bow to one-up. It's a very strange idea, because assassins aren't really notably known for using just bows. I know Connor did, he was very good with his bow, and Cassandra, Bayek, and Ava are all good at bows, but assassins are more known for their swords and hidden blades. So an assassin that uses a bow, it's kind of against the norm, but if it's a bow of Eden, you're not going to object, are you? The next one is the Malta Sword of the St. John's Knight Sword, also known as the Sword of Malta. Its really long title is Malta Sword of the Knights of St. John 1565. Now, I kind of found quite a lot of information on the Knights of Malta, and this sword really stuck out for me. It was originally what kick-started this episode. And the reason why it stood out to us is this sword was called Sword of Malta in memory of the fierce battle during the Siege of Malta, in which the Knights of St. John stopped the huge Ottoman militia from further entering their territory. Pretty cool. And again, you're going to say, it's a Sword of Eden. That's all it is, Sword of Eden, let's move on. But I'm going to twist it on its head. Now, during a lot of research, it seems these Swords of Malta, or the Knight Sword of St. John, there's a lot of links to them being called arming swords, just by the way they're designed, with the cross on the hilt, the crescent-shaped guard, and the woven handle. So there's a lot of links to arming swords. There probably are all different swords. The sword of this Saint Knight's sword is called the Sword of Malta. It is a single weapon, but it is in the description as arming swords that were used by the Templar agents of Malta that I found in history. I did kind of start off as a big rabbit hole. The Knights of Malta were originally a Templar order through the First Crusade. Now, as we know, by law standards, the Knights Templar didn't become a public face till 1129 through Bernard and Hugh de Payne. I have an episode planned around that, but not saying much more. So it was a hard one to build around, is what I'm trying to get at. So instead of going down the same route as it's a Sword of Eden, and seeing as the Sword of Malta has links to the Knights of Malta, I decided to go down the route that this is a sword created through shards of Swords of Eden. These swords are very incomplete. They're not full pieces of Eden. They were made from Swords of Eden, which makes them very much, how do I word it, broken. The ability I would have given them is a very basic ability of invulnerability and strength. But if you had a full completed Sword of Eden, you would be unstoppable. But because it was broken and divided and lost to time, it became that these abilities would work sometimes and sometimes not. So if you had 10 soldiers fighting all with Swords of Malta, and each of them was created from the same Sword of Eden, then 2 to 5 could gain the abilities of invulnerability and strength. And judging by the cause they were fighting, people would have saw that as probably divine intervention, or luck, or skill of the swordman. they wouldn't really look at it as a piece of Eden that would catch their eye as something mythical. And it's that key I wanted to hold on to. That what if we created a piece of Eden that people would blink and you'd miss it? It has a very strong ability, but because it's incomplete, it was eventually lost to time. The Templars and Assassins never chased the Sword of Malta because they never knew it was a piece of Eden. I think this would make a really great connection to Assassin's Creed, because Assassin's Creed has too many pieces of Eden that are either start incomplete, like the Spear of Leonidas for Cassandra, and eventually become whole, to apples of Eden that are already overpowered. It would be nice to have a piece of Eden that is broken from the offset, that an assassin could wield, but have no knowledge that it's a piece of Eden. They could wield it and its power could take effect, and they could win a battle single-handedly. Or they can take it and it could be slain in battle because it's just a sword. This makes it one of the most unique pieces of Eden in Assassin's Creed lore, if it was able to fit. The other reason why I decided to latch onto the idea of a shard is I think Assassin's Creed has way too many swords of Eden. It's becoming, in my opinion, too more knowledgeable to make a sword and stamp on Sword of Eden. We know that swords, pieces of Eden, are very hard to destroy, but we don't know what can destroy a piece of Eden. And we don't know fully if something can be built out of a piece of Eden. So I think in theory it'd be nice to see if it was possible that a sword could be built from a piece of Eden, making it a piece of Eden, but not one that is overpowered or one that is technically a Sword of Eden. It's just what I would dub a Shard of Eden. And a Shard of Eden could be a collective term of pieces of Eden that have been broken into mundane artifacts like swords, shields, hats, gloves, belts. I don't know, Belt of Eden wouldn't work, but there would all be that shard. So the Malta Swords of Malta, in my opinion, would be a Shard of Eden that would grant its wearer abilities of strength and vulnerability, but it's incomplete and inconcise. The final one is, I left it to last because it's the one that made me chuckle the most. It's one of the most debated topics from Mythbusters, modern tests, history, science, you name it. And that is Archimedes Death Ray. Now, a lot of people will argue that Archimedes Death Ray, which used mirror and sunlight to burn holes in Roman ships, was real. Some scholars would argue that it was fiction. A lot of modern tests have proven it to work, and some have proven it false. So how do I turn this into a piece of Eden? How do I turn knowledge that it could have worked and knowledge it couldn't have worked into a fictional story? And I think the easiest way I could, do that is that we keep it close to history as possible. We know that Archimedes' idea was to use mirrors to concentrate sunlight into a focused beam that would burn holes on the Roman ship. But I would argue that in this sense, for law purposes and theory, that these mirrors weren't mirrors. They were a reflection device more commonly linked to solar panels. And their original purpose was to be all completed together, scattered over precise locations around the world. So when the first solar wave hit, it would store up the solar energy and disperse it safely in another direction, a countermeasure to the total catastrophe. But in law, this never worked. As they were too busy chasing more methods, this method was left abandoned because it was inconsistent. As we already know by real history, Archimedes' Death Ray, also known as the Heat Ray, is inconsistent. Some tests say it worked, some tests say it doesn't, some say it never had, some say it always did. So using that, we could say that this piece of Eden was created to divert sunlight and safely stop the total catastrophe, but it's too inconsistent for the Isu to keep chasing. How Archimedes got hold of this is unknown. All historical texts around his heat ray have been lost, in theory, due to time. I do believe that he could have had them stolen by the Cult of Cosmos, who originally destroyed by Cassandra, and then all of the information was just gone. No one knows. But I believe that he came in contact with several of these solar panels, but didn't know what to do with them, and he used their reflection surfaces as a bounce method. He put them in certain precise locations to bounce sunlight. I believe that if he knew what he was doing, he could in theory connect them together to create the full dial that was created, and then used these startups' energy as a single ray. Instead of one that bounces back, it would have been a single focused ray with more kinetic energy and more potential for heat. I think this would be a really great connection to the lore, because we know that in Greece there is a ton of Piece of Eden, and I think I would link this one to Atlantis. I think this could be really like a human Isu contraption built together to help with the turbo accessory, but it went wrong. Maybe the records were lost when Atlantis sunk. Who knows? Maybe they kept going, but they just abandoned it because it was not perfect. It didn't always work. So I am about to end the episode, and I realised on my notes pinging me, I've only done 4 out of 5. How silly of me. It's one of them weeks where I am not with it. So the final one was kind of a toss-up between Pandora's Box and the Waters of Styx. Now the only reason for this is I do have an obsession with Greek mythology. Greek mythology is fantastic, along with Egyptian mythology, Norse mythology, any mythology I enjoy. And I believe the Waters of Styx, and Pandora's Box was lost potential in Odyssey. Now I did have a lot of notes on Pandora's Box, as I assumed that this would be the best one to focus on. But then I read about the Shroud of Eden. The Shroud of Eden gave people the ability to heal, and it was rumoured to link to Jason and the Golden Fleece. And then I thought, well, what if the first Shroud of Eden was a pool? Pool of water that was later known as the River Styx. And in the legendary Battle of Troy, this pool was found. We don't know who, and we don't know who told them. This is the ambiguity that I want to give to the lore. Putting Achilles, sorry I nearly got the name wrong then, dipping Achilles into the pool granted him immortality, but it only left his heel vulnerable. Now in the Isu lore, the biggest flaw is that they were never able to make enough of the water. So whenever somebody was submerged, there was always a part of them left, vulnerable. And it became too much to then, even if it was the back of their head, their back, their heel, it became too much resources to always give them armour to protect one spot. So they didn't bother. They abandoned it for a more controversial method, maybe, more of an easier method. That's why they focused on the Shroud. So this River Styx was lost to ages. It was abandoned. This is the lore I'm going to go with. That it was abandoned and never looked at again. But it was found in Greece during the battle, before the Battle of Troy, way before the Battle of Troy. Otherwise, Achilles would have been a lot older than I'm thinking. So, using this, Achilles was dipped in, and he became immortal. He was then eventually killed because of the back of his heel was left vulnerable. And I would really love to see this implemented as just Isu lore. Maybe no connection to Assassins or Templars, because I always argue that it's nice to see variation. Maybe link it more to Isu, less to Assassins. So this is the only Piece of Eden I would say has no connection to Assassins or Templars. This is a purely Isu device, Isu creation that was lost to time because it wasn't valuable enough. When you're battling a human revolution, you don't want to waste all your resources on everything. And maybe they found that this was just too costly, it left people vulnerable, and then eventually it was just lost to time being destroyed. Where Achilles' mother found it, under the advice she dipped a child into it, except his heel, and eventually he became the famous legend who battled in Troy. To be honest, I wish the River Styx was focused on in Odyssey. I think that would have been cool. Cassandra finding the River Styx would have been a pretty cool trick, but as I did discuss, I did want to discuss Pandora's Box, because I think Pandora's Box would have fit in as a piece of Eden that contained tons of diseases over time, and maybe it was something they stored as a way to learn how to treat people. But falling into wrong hands, it could have then been used as an accidental weapon. That's the idea I wanted to go with, but I kind of found it was a bit too simple to do. This is why I chose the Rivers of Styx. Waters of Styx. So I hope you really enjoyed this episode, and I would love to do something like this again. Take a look at some artifacts, some jewellery, anything, and try and turn them into piece of Eden. If you have any suggestions, please hit them up, and I will hit me up on Twitter at ACLet'sTalk, or email Assassin'sCreedLet'sTalk@gmail.com, and I'll happily look into seeing how I can fit into them, and maybe you can come on board with me to discuss your theories. If you would like to discuss this episode in details, then please follow me on the links. And I have really exciting stuff planned coming up, so I'm really excited to share with you more details of the next episodes that are upcoming. And thank you for tuning in every week, and I hope to see you all next week. Thank you.